The number 3 best chess game of the 1970s is Bagirov vs. Gufeld from 1973. This immortal game, termed the Mona Lisa by its victor, Gufeld, who wrote an entire and excellent book about his search for this particular game, features scintillating play from both sides. Bagirov fully commits to a kingside attack and almost gets there, but Gufeld finds just enough counterplay and finishes with an amazing combination. Now, this game is incredible, but the players are fascinating as well. Bagirov was born in Baku and ultimately became the trainer for the beast from Baku, Garry Kasparov. Gufeld, on the other hand, was known as an amiable player who prized aesthetics and brilliance over practical results. He was also the trainer for a world champion, women's world champion Maya Chiberdanidze. The darker side of Gufeld's story is that he was accused in the book The KGB Plays Chess of being a KGB informant. However, he would always fervently deny these accusations. Gufeld begins his notes to this game by saying, "This game was unique in my career. I am not Fischer, Karpov, or Kasparov, whose genius is always awake, but I am grateful to my destiny for this particular evening." The game goes d4, g6, c4, and bishop g7. In fact, this bishop here was known as the Gufeld Bishop in some circles because Gufeld's affection for the dark squared fianchettoed bishop and for any opening where he could get a dark squared fianchettoed bishop was so well known. The game continues here, knight c3, pawn to d6, e4, knight f6, pawn to f3, the solid same-ish variation that is going to lead to a wild game in this particular case, and in actually quite a lot of same-ish variations. Castles, bishop e3, knight to c6, knight g to e2, rook b8, queen d2, pawn to a6, and now bishop h6. Now, I generally frown upon this move when you're not castled and you haven't completed development. However, it's not a bad move here, and there is the justification from Gufeld, who explains that Bagirov is just trying to exchange off the Gufeld bishop and basically say to Gufeld, "Hey, I traded off your favorite bishop. How are you going to play chess now?" At this point, one move that I can recommend is bishop takes h6, queen takes, and then use the fact that the queen is now off sides due to the recapture to strike in the middle of the board, pawn to e5. The game is very complex, but this is usually my recommended antidote. Now, in the game, Gufeld doesn't go for this. Basically, neither player is taking time out for subtleties in this game, and Gufeld tries pawn to b5, getting counterplay on the queen side as quickly as he can. Meanwhile, once again, neither player is slowing down here, pawn to h4 from Bagirov. He's of course willing to sacrifice the pawn on c4 and allow Gufeld to open up the line over here. He just wants to get there as quickly as possible with an attack on the h-file and deliver checkmate. After pawn to h4, we see the move pawn to e5, and Gufeld says, "We all know that a flank attack is best countered by action in the center." And this is a perfect example of correct play. Bagirov exchanges off the Gufeld bishop, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and now pawn to h5. A small pawn sacrifice to open lines, especially the h-file on the king side. This move recalls the Karpov vs. Korchnoi game that was our 5th best game of the 70s. Now, after pawn to h5, I think Gufeld makes maybe his most significant mistake of the game. The strongest move according to the engines, and I think the most sensible one, was the simple capture on c4. After the capture here on g6 and then queen h6 check, the king can fall back to g8. Instead, Gufeld decides ahead of time that he would rather put the king on h8 and does so immediately here. However, this places him on the brink of defeat. After king h8, we see knight to d5, trying to exchange off that critical defender on f6. Again, very like the Karpov vs. Korchnoi game. And now pawn takes c4, a capture on g6, and the introduction of the queen, queen to h6. There are big threats here. Now, the most obvious threat is just knight takes f6 and then mate right here, but also queen takes g6 is very strong. There is only one idea for black that gives any hope of saving the game. It is a brilliant idea, and Gufeld does find it. Knight to h5. Now, this incredible move intends to sacrifice the knight to close the h-file to gain enough time for counterplay on the other side of the board. At this point, Bagirov should have been patient. Now, neither player demonstrates patience in this game, so it's not surprising that Bagirov doesn't do it now, but it would have been best to just go ahead and castle. In this position, the b2 pawn is defended, and you can play g4 on the next move, and you're nearly winning. Instead, Bagirov decides it's time for g4 right away. I'm going to win your knight on h5, and my king can fend for itself. After pawn to g4, we see here the move rook takes b2, getting that counterplay and saying, hey, your king's not going to be too safe. Pawn takes h5, and then the brilliant move, pawn to g5. This move closes off the h-file, and it also sequesters the queen on h6. Gufeld comments, chess really is an amazing game. Just look at this position. My opponent has an extra piece and serious threats on the king side. Nevertheless, both players are walking a tightrope. And looking at this game with a chess engine, and by the way, this game baffles chess engines, one suggestion that stood out to me was the move pawn to f4. This move, trying to tear open lines to get at this king, is really very, very scary, but it does seem that there's enough counterplay only if you play the move bishop g4. This has the idea of capturing on e2 and then playing knight takes d4. It also introduces the possibility of queen b8 and then queen b4. The computer gives 0.00 after this move, but of course anything can happen and black has very interesting counterplay. Now, instead of this move pawn to f4, what we actually see is possibly the better move, rook to g1. Of course, the idea is simply to capture here and then mate on g7, or just generally use the g-file for a crushing attack. However, after rook g4, we see another great move from Gufeld, pawn to g4. He says, now the fight is in full swing. White's king 2 is under fire. And this is a defensive move because it's trying to close down the g-file, but it also is an attacking move. It has the idea of queen to h4 check. So Bagirov responds, castles queenside. A really incredible castling move that gets the king out of the way of this queen h4 check and attacks the rook on b2. Now, that rook on b2 has got to move, so it's going to pick up the pawn over here on a2. Rook takes a2, and Gufeld notes, what a mess. Both kings are under fire, but there isn't a jot of attacking force in either corner. The kings just feel naked here, but it's surprisingly hard to get to either king. Now, in this position, Bagirov goes for the knockout blow. At this point, the engine says that 20 f4 and 20 captures on e5 are both 0.00. Of course, the positions are crazy complicated, and again, anything can happen. But a losing mistake seems to be knight e to f4, but only because Gufeld finds an incredible response. After this move, the idea of going for knight g6 check looks to be finishing things off. Now, sure, you can capture once, pawn takes f4, but the knight recaptures, and again, knight to g6 seems like a problem. At this point, Gufeld goes for rook takes f4, a necessary exchange sacrifice. The queen falls back to f4, but again at this point, what about ideas like capturing here and then just getting some pieces to the f-file and invading? White is up material, and it still seems to be the black king that is under more fire. Now we get pawn to c3, an excellent move from Gufeld, who says, when the rook cuts off the white king on the second rank, there is always the possibility of coordination with the pawn and the knight. Though this threat is repelled, the c3 pawn remains like a bayonet held against the white king's throat. Now Bagirov continues bishop c4, attacking the rook on a2. There is only one winning retreat for this rook. It is rook to a3 as played by Gufeld. Why is this the only winning retreat? Well, as it turns out, later it will be important that you can capture a bishop on b3 with the rook. Who knew? We'll see that in a moment. An interesting alternative was rook to a4, and I'm not going to get into it here, but check the notes if you're interested in some very fascinating lines from Gufeld. Now, after the accurate move rook to a3, we see pawn takes g4, and Gufeld says, the value of this game is enhanced by the fact that white is not making desperado moves, but keeps setting new obstacles for his opponent and putting up a most stubborn resistance. By giving up the extra material, Bagirov repels the immediate threats to his king, and black's attacking pieces lose their coordination just for a moment. Therefore, black must gather his strength and make heroic efforts. Knight to b4 with a threat of mate here on a1. king to b1, responding to the threat. Now, after king b1, this is a great moment to pause your video if you, like Gufeld, want to try and play a Mona Lisa. You should see not just the next move, but the move after as well. In this position, bishop to e6. Stunning and brilliant from Gufeld. The idea is not too complicated. Let's get the queen to the b file, but the ensuing calculations are really incredibly complex. Now, after bishop e6, Gufeld says, the position seems to be in total chaos. White owns the center, but that hardly seems relevant. It is a question of who can get his pieces into a mating formation first. After bishop e6, there's not much choice. Bishop takes e6. And now that second move that you need to have seen when you played bishop to e6. Knight to d3. Now this is the only good move. Of course, you are trying to get your queen to the b file and get her there with check. Knight to d3 is good because it gains time and attacks the white queen here. It also allows for a blockade on this d3 square, so that if the rook captures here with rook takes d3, there is queen to b8 check, king c2, queen into b2 check, no escape here to d3, and king d1, rook a1 with a forced mate. Alternatively, you might consider here knight to d5, which moves the knight out of the way and still attacks the queen. But this allows the capture with the e-pawn that is going to allow the king to escape in this direction, and there is no mate. Another point here is that you need to move the knight before you bring the queen over, because if queen to b8 right away, there is immediately queen to f6 and checkmate. So you are going to need to continue with checks as black. After this brilliant move knight to d3, we see queen to f7, a very, very good try. Now queen to b8 check, and if you move the king over with king c2, it's just a quick forced mate. Knight to b4 check, king back to b1, knight to d5 check, which cuts off this defense here, and then the queen and the rook are invading. King c2, rook to a2 check, king d3, and queen b5 is a nice mate. But after queen to b8 check, we see bishop to b3. And once again, I said earlier that we needed to go to a3 so that we could capture on b3 with a rook later. This is that moment. Of course, we cannot capture with the queen and allow a trade of queens. So now, rook takes b3 check and king c2. Gufeld comments, Bagirov was hoping to take advantage of the lack of coordination between the black pieces. Both the rook and the knight are under fire. How can black now bring up more heavy artillery? The right move here is another 2 exclamation mark brilliant move. It is knight to b4 check. You can sacrifice the rook here on b3, and the queen and knight can get the job done by themselves. After knight to b4 check, we get king takes b3, knight to d5 check, which cuts off the queen here and makes sure that the c3 pawn is defended. Of course, the c3 pawn is critical. Now, there are a lot of king moves that get mated immediately, like running to the a file, which is going to allow the queen to come into b4 or b2 and give checkmate. And if you run up the board with king c4, then there is an immediate and pretty mate here with queen to b5 checkmate. Very, very fine. Now, after knight d5 check, the best move is king c2. This is the only move that isn't getting mated right away. Now it looks like the white king may be able to run around a bit. Queen b2 check, king to d3, and now queen to b5. It is at this point that Bagirov resigned. But why did he resign? He can go back to c2. Isn't this just a perpetual after queen to b2? Well, if the queen went back to b2, yes, but the queen is not going to b2. After queen b5, king c2, there is queen to e2, and the queen is going on a little bit of a circular staircase maneuver. King to b3, queen to b2 check, king to c4, and the queen has circled back around to b5, and it is mate. A very fine finishing checkmating position. Gufeld finished his comments to this game by saying, every painter dreams of creating his own Mona Lisa. No other game has ever given me so much satisfaction. Even now, after over a quarter of a century, I still take pleasure in recalling this game. then I forget my troubles and remember that the dream came true. I hope that you have enjoyed this game and gotten some satisfaction from this game like so many before you. If you want to see more of my best games from the 70s, both videos that I've recorded already and videos that I'm soon to record, then please do click on the playlist that is sitting right on top of your screen.